Hello and welcome back here on the Root stage. I am very pleased to announce our first proper talk and speaker of the day. It's Vojtěch. He is a sustainability researcher who works at the Charles University Environment Center in Prague, and he will share insights into the current debate on nature restoration, opportunities it offers for modern life, and why everything ultimately depends on politics. Please, a warm welcome to Vojtěch.
Thank you, and good morning. So I went through the agenda for the coming 3 days, and my first impression was what I'm doing here, because there is a lot of in common between sustainability and your world. Both of them deal with a lot of data. Both of them kind of revolve around electricity. Both of them work with screens quite often. But what I'm talking about is the part of the sustainability which doesn't actually deal with almost any electricity, data, or screens. And it may be why it's actually important for our discussions in the coming 3 days, because it will show us that there are angles of our world and angles of sustainability that are superficially different from what we do in our everyday lives, but might be important for how we live, how we relate to the world, and what is important for us. Could you raise your hand if you believe that we should protect nature? Okay, thank you. I will spend the next minutes trying to persuade you that along with protecting nature, we also need to do something different. We also need to restore nature. And a good example of why we can do that is what has been happening in European nature in previous several decades. No. I'm afraid it doesn't work. Okay, yep, sorry. So, when I was a kid, in 1970s, 1980s, there were lots of animals that used to be part of European landscapes, but when I was a kid, were nothing more than memories of the lost past. Wolves, beavers, cranes, bear, lynxes, wildcats, many different raptors. Animals that used to live across Europe, but disappeared before we came to this world. But then in about 1970s, 1980s and 90s, these animals started to silently creep back into European landscapes rather unexpectedly. This is white-tailed eagle. It's one of the largest eagles in the world. It's so big that people sometimes describe it as flying barn door, a gigantic animal, which used to be common sight in European landscapes, but it almost completely disappeared from Central and East and Western Europe by the end of 19th century. And it's been gone for decades when I was a kid. And then in about 1980s, first birds started to breed again in Central and Western Europe, and now it's a widespread animal again. More than 100 nests in this country alone every year. There are thousands of these birds across the densely populated landscapes of Central and Western Europe. Eurasian beaver. 100 years ago, there were 1,300 Eurasian beavers left in the world, in the entire world, in several scattered, isolated refugee populations in several places in mainly in Western and Central Europe. Right now, there are 100,000 beavers in Latvia alone. There's more than 1 million beavers across Europe. It's becoming a common animal again. And the same thing is happening with many other species. They're coming back, beavers, lynxes, eagles, falcons, wolves, and they are showing up in rather unexpected places. Beavers found their habitat in Prague and other cities, along with otters. Wolves live in closed former coal mines. Peregrine falcons, once an extinct species in Central Europe, live in coal power plants, where they found good isolated places for nesting. Belt ibis, it's a bird which looks like particularly ugly pterodactyl, and it used to live commonly in Alps, but disappeared something like 500 years ago. It's been gone for decades. It's globally endangered species. There's a huge international project to return the species back to European mountains, and it works. 2 years ago, the first pair of belt ibises built their nest in Switzerland after something like half a millennium. And to build that nest, they chose one particular place, a window of Harley-Davidson dealership in Zurich airport, of all places. And also nature itself suddenly discovered that we can coexist in populated landscape, that we are able to share the landscape and to work with it. And this is an important lesson because meanwhile, while all these rare extinct species were coming back, we lost a lot of what we could call everyday nature. A common European hare is a good example. Common game species that used to be hunted throughout European countryside. It was common sight in fields and farms. I was born in 1974. The number of hare shot by Czech hunters decreased by 97% since mid-1970s. And it's not because hunters suddenly became very human and took pity of the hare. It's because hare disappeared. The population of common farmland bird species halved since 1980s. Just during the previous decade, since 2010, European landscapes lost, during just one decade, lost about 1/3 of grassland butterfly species, of grassland butterfly populations, butterflies that live in meadows, pastures, and similar habitats. We are losing previously common places in our landscapes like flowering meadows or free-flowing rivers. Bees, birds, butterflies are disappearing in European landscape. And not only we lose the living world that we used to share the landscape with, we also lose productivity of the landscape consequently. Because of loss of nature, soil is disappearing from arable land. We are losing tons and tons of soil. The landscape is losing its ability to catch and restore and catch water, so that it is less resilient to climate change. It loses its productivity because it loses water, soil, pollination, small predators that would hunt or kill species or animals that destroy crops, and pests, and so on. And this is why we started to think that we might need to, along with protecting nature, we might need to restore nature in European landscapes. But at the same time, restoration is kind of misleading word because it sort of implies that we are restoring something from the past. Well, we want to restore richness and abundance of nature that we lost, that used to be part of our landscapes and that we lost. But we can't restore nature in 21st century society by restoring 19th century landscapes. What we need to do is to find ways to restore nature into modern economy, urban society, and technological world. And that is the key challenge. There are probably three key directions we are looking at. First, we need to find suitable places where we could simply return to nature. Places in remote uplands, forests, coasts, where we would restore large-scale wetlands or wild forests, where we could restore dynamics of wild nature, return important phenomena of natural world like large herbivores, animals like European bison that shape their own habitat and create important habitats for other species. But along with that, we will probably want to restore a lot of nature much closer to us, much closer to where we live. And this is a good example. It looks like some kind of nature reserve or even national park. And in many European countries, this would be probably a nature reserve, free-flowing wild river. This is the center of Munich. In Munich, something like 30 years ago, the city council had to deal with flood protection. And when consulting with their water engineers, they were advised that the best way to protect the city from floods is to restore the free flow of the river Isar in the city, to make it wider, shallower, to restore all these small islands, pools, natural riverbanks, curvating a river, and other aspects of wild flowing river, free flowing river that will be able to contain much more water in case of flood. So they did so. And while doing that, they discovered that they actually, at the same time, while providing flood protection for the city, created a brilliant habitat for many rare species of fish, birds, or insects that live in free-flowing rivers, and an excellent recreational space. People love it. In summer, hot summer days, thousands of people go to the wild river to use the cold, clean alpine water. It's much better than communal pools or municipal swimming pools. And it's not just a short stretch. There is an 8 kilometers of the restored wild river in central Munich, one of the biggest, most dynamic, modern Central European cities. And last but not least, we need to find a way to restore small-scale natural habitats throughout our European landscapes. And here it's important to realize what we actually use European landscape for. When we think about how we squeeze out nature in Europe, what we first focus on is the most visible artificial structures like cities. Infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, factories, and so on. But in reality, these are definitely important, but it's just several percent of our European landscape. What we use vast majority of European landscapes for is commodity production. We use them to produce timber, agricultural commodities, even freshwater fish. We use landscapes to produce commodities, and what we need to do is to find ways to integrate nature into commodity production in our lands. We need to find and develop incentives that will help landowners, farmers, forest owners to incorporate nature into their everyday business. And it doesn't need to be big stretches of wild nature. What will definitely help is small-scale habitats that will measure just several meters. But a web of these small habitats in European landscapes, places like this, small hedgerows, meadows, minor wetlands, and so on, will create a mosaic of natural habitats along with productive land that will provide habitat for birds, bees, and butterflies, and also increase productivity and protect land against drought, soil erosion, and similar phenomena. This is a major task for European. This is a major task for European policy in coming. There is one slide missing for some reason. This is a major political task, policy task for European and national politics in coming decades. We will need to find incentives and policy solutions that will help landowners to return nature to our landscapes, starting with farmland and forests, and including places like cities, urban areas, where we can find small pieces of land that will provide nature to our everyday life. Thank you.
So much. I do think we have a couple of minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand so that our volunteers can find you with a mic. Yes, there's one in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to hear your comments about Amsterdam. I was there recently, and I noticed, the first thing I noticed was, I come from Slovenia, the first thing I noticed is it looked really sloppy and messy. And the next thing I noticed was there were a lot of birds. And what they've done in Amsterdam is they just stopped cutting all the lawns in public places.
Yeah.
And in Europe, like I said, coming from Slovenia, I'm like, wow, it looks kind of messy. Like, how can we re-educate ourselves that that messiness is actually a habitat? And how realistic is that to do in many of the European countries?
Yep, this is a good point. I think that there are two things to say about that. First, I think that we are in process of doing that. 15 years ago, even in the most progressive cities in Europe, nobody would think about leaving lawns unmowed because, this is what you do. And we are starting to do that. We are starting to realize that it's good for nature, that it's good for our own life, for our enjoyment of cities, and that it is even good for management of the lawns themselves in like periods of dry summer and so on. And I think that we will get there. We are in the process. Secondly, it's also important to realize that we actually need to mow the lawns. We can't just turn them into wilderness. Because not only because they are in cities and we do not necessarily want to have total wilderness in the middle of our cities, but perhaps more importantly, because mowing is important for creation and maintaining the habitat for the flowers that all the bees and butterflies depend on. We need to mow them. We just need to make sure that we do not mow them once a month or something like that, that we do not create this short grass that is devoid of any nature. But we do need to mow them. And actually in the wider landscape, one of the key challenges is that we are not only turning places like meadows into intensive farmland, but at the same time, in many places in Europe, we are just abandoning them, leaving them without management. That has been working there for millennia in some areas, and they are turning into forest, which is much less biodiverse than the flowering hay meadows. By the way, when you look at the botanical data across the world and look at the sites with the highest botanical diversity per 1/4 of square meter in the world, the highest, the global records you get are not from some rainforest or other tropical habitats. What you will find in the world records are meadows in Carpathians. The first one is a nature reserve on the border between Czechia and Slovakia. And the other ones are from Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and they are meadows, basically farmland. But farmland that has been managed traditionally for millennia.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, there are 2 in the middle and 1 in the front. Raise your hand again. Yeah.
Appreciate you mentioning Carpathian. I was surprised to hear it's really biodiverse. My question is on invasive species and, for example, lupin, L-U-P-I-N. I come from Lisbon, and there I see this invasive species even in kind of botanical gardens where they cut some shrubs, and next year, let's imagine 50% of that cut territory is busy with lupins, and the second year I see 100% of territory is like really spiking with it. Why is it so difficult to get rid of them? I understand that they come in from another ecosystem, they're taking a place in this new ecosystem where they don't have any force to minimize their growth, right? So what are the recent developments in this field of managing the invasive species?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's probably important to realize that there are thousands of exotic species, plants, insects, animals in Europe, and vast majority of them doesn't cause much trouble. We are able to either control them or they just occur locally. There are no problem at all. But then there are several dozens of species that cause problems because they overgrow the original habitats or the native habitats, or they kill native animals and so on. And there is probably nothing we can do about that than to eradicate them. And it's difficult. In some cases, we basically gave up because we can't do much about that anymore. And in some cases, like lupin, we are trying to control them. It requires a lot of effort, but we work, and in some cases we are actually able to control them. There are several species of plants, of invasive plants in Central Europe that we were kind of able to control. Invasive animals are becoming a major problem.
And by which means? Like introducing other plants or other animals?
Cutting them. They are able to grow because we left the space for them, so that if we start cutting them, taking them out of the land and just removing them, basically killing the plants, we could be able to control them. But it works in some cases, it doesn't work elsewhere.
What to do in cases when cutting them doesn't work? If I knew the answer, I would be extremely
extremely popular in European nature conservation. We have no idea. And we are in process of working on that. But we are afraid that in some cases we will not be able to find a solution because they are better than we are.
Godspeed your efforts. Thank you.
Fortunately, this is not exactly what I work on.
Okay, there are a few more questions. Let's do one more in the interest of time. Yes?
Thank you. I wanted to ask you if you can share a bit more about your rewilding vision for Prague and if there are already projects on the way leading towards that.
Yeah. There are some interesting projects by the city council. For example, well, there is nothing in the pipeline as big as the Munich case, but there are lots of small projects of the city council to restore stretches, either stretches of the river or even much longer stretches of some small rivers or streams in the city. They are working on that piece by piece. And interestingly, again, something that wasn't the case about 10 years ago. It is becoming something the city planning is starting to think about systematically, how to bring nature back into the city. And they quite naturally, they started first with the rivers. And second, an interesting moment is grasslands. Prague is basically on the verge of, Prague is a river canyon. And there are some smaller canyons at the edge of the city. And Prague is basically on the verge of a limestone landscape that is southwest of Prague, karst area which is very biodiverse. And the city council and some environmental groups, conservation groups, are working on interesting projects to restore especially traditional grasslands in this area and in some parts of the river canyon. Interestingly, there are more than 80 nature reserves in Prague, in the city, because there are lots of those small pieces of nature that survived in the middle of the city.
Thank you so much, Wojciech, for this very beautiful and inspiring talk. One last applause to him.
Thank you.
And